Welcome to Behind the Headline, where we dig deeper into stories that captured the attention of East Tennessee. We hear from journalists who covered that headline to hear straight from the source about the editorial decisions and the discussions, the process essentially of bringing the information to the viewer or the reader. So today, we are revisiting a name that made headlines in East Tennessee during the 1990s. You may remember the name Thomas "Zooman" Huskey, once a familiar face at the Knoxville Zoo. He became infamous for a series of brutal crimes that essentially terrorized the city of Knoxville. From chilling confessions to courtroom twists and turns, Huskey's case is one that left scars on both the victims' families and really the community at large. In this episode, we will walk through the crimes, the trials, and the questions that still linger decades later about who Huskey really was and why his story still matters. Now, it all started on October 20th, 1992, when the body of a woman was discovered off a remote road in East Knox County, Cahaba Lane. Take a look.
A man walking in this wooded area just off Catawba Lane found the woman's body just before 5 o'clock. She was wearing a green, white, and yellow sweater, blue jean shorts, and high heels. The victim was discovered about 15 yards beyond the area where the trees meet the road, and detectives say they believe the body has been there a while.
Well, the condition of the body would appear that she may have been. We're going to let some people that are more schooled in those areas take a look at the body and make a determination on how long she's actually been there.
Freeman and other investigators are also working to determine how she got there. Residents say this dead-end road is a place for partying and drinking. It's not known if the woman was killed on the spot or murdered somewhere else and brought here. KPD Detective Tommy Stiles was brought to the scene soon after the body was discovered to help identify the victim. Chuck Denny, Action 10 News Today.
That report from Chuck Denny, then a reporter. Chuck Denny joining us here in studio, former WBIR reporter. Thanks for being with us. Let's talk about this story. You did the first story as this case was breaking. Tell us, how did you get this story as the reporter at WBIR?
Right, I'm guessing we heard it on the scanner, and we responded out to Cahaba Lane. First of all, it was tough to get there because we couldn't figure out, these days way before GPS and all, and we're trying to figure out the back roads, how to get there. So finally
we had maps in our cars.
We had maps. You can see it from the interstate, but you can't really get there. So we finally got there on location. They had discovered a body in the woods off Cahaba Lane. So I'm kind of there hanging out on the other side of the police tape, and a detective comes out and goes, "We've got two." And I'm like, two bodies, two victims, and that's when the story kind of elevated in magnitude right there. So and then just from there, I just always remember. Well, first of all, I remember the date, October 20th, 1992, because it was my 30th birthday. So I spent my 30th birthday doing live shots from Cahaba Lane. But I just remember then, what time of year was it? It was Halloween. But this was a real life horror story, an eerie feeling. And I just remember kind of, you talked about the scars on the community there in your intro. I remember just the mood of the city, how there was an eerie feeling over Knoxville that people were like, because then later other victims were discovered. Right. So it was clear that these were connected. So now people are going, well, there's a serial killer walking around amongst us here in Knoxville. And I just remember, the streets were empty at night. Mm-hmm. I mean, people were really scared.
They were terrified, mm-hmm. Particularly one group in mm-hmm. particular in the community, and that was that of prostitutes. Mm-hmm. But one thing that struck me as I was watching your story was mm-hmm. you were right there. Yeah. On the scene. That would be a challenge in this day and time to mm-hmm. have that kind of access to that kind of search and inevitably murder scene. Mm-hmm. How did you comprehend this when he says, we have two?
Yeah, I guess, sometimes in those days, if we arrived on a scene pretty quickly, we were where we were, and then the police tape got put up based on that. And so I'm guessing that's kind of what happened that day. But yeah, we were right there. The road, Cahaba Lane, comes to an end right there. And then there's the woods there. And to this day, I can't drive down the interstate and not look over at those woods and think about that's where the killings were, that's where the bodies were. But we got there, we were very close, and there was a lot of activity. In those days, technology-wise, we had these old live trucks. I think I see them still out in the parking lot here.
We have one or two left.
Yeah, they're still, and those things they didn't work in every location around, so we had to, move it around and all. So we were in an area there where we were just trying to get the signal out, which we eventually did. But yeah, it was biggest news story I think I ever covered in my years as a reporter.
I was going to ask you, where it landed,
yeah,
and,
right
and
up there.
Definitely, I remember covering it as well. When this was playing out, what was the sense you were getting from law enforcement on the scene? Because you are watching this in real time. Was there a sense of
I remember specifically Tommy Stiles, who was a detective with KPD. Of course, Knox County it was their case, but KPD was called in. And I think I remember I interviewed Detective Stiles, and I said, okay, does this victim look familiar to you? And his soundbite was something like, yeah, I think I know her. And so that kind of, for law enforcement, they were kind of like, we knew these people, these young women, and they were, it's not, you got these grizzled detectives who've seen a little bit of everything, but when they are bothered by something, then it must be pretty bothersome.
Yeah. And do you think they were thinking,
I think so.
This is a serial killer?
Well, at that time they had two victims on October 20th, and then a few days later, I apologize if I'm incorrect on this, but I think it was my dad's birthday. My birthday was the 20th, my dad's was the 26th, and I think it was on my dad's birthday, like 6 days later, that they found the others. So I just remember it was day one, October 20th. It was late in the afternoon. It's October, the sun's sinking fast. It was getting very dark, so they were hustling to try to search these woods, because already, even though it's dusk, the woods are dark. So they're dealing with that at the time. But yeah, and they, and then when you've got multiple victims, that's bothersome for them as well.
Yeah, and you brought up that point. Then not only for law enforcement, but for the community.
Yeah,
there was a sense of true fear.
There was, and I think we maybe did a piece on that. Again, I apologize, but 33 years ago. But yeah, I think the streets were empty at night. People were scared. There was that eerie mood around the city, and maybe Knoxville had a serial killer in the past, and we just didn't know about it. But for the first time, we kind of confirmed that yes, we have a serial killer. And
with that, we did do a story. To be exact, I remember I was tasked, myself and photographer Jerry Owens, to go and talk to prostitutes who were living in fear of this person who eventually was named as Thomas Zooman Huskey, and we'll get into why he was called Zooman Huskey. But this is our report from our experience talking to these women who were afraid for their lives. Take a look.
Behind this downtown Knoxville bar, in total darkness, no cameras allowed, Tina tells what she does for a living.
I accept money from men that want to have a good time.
Tina, not her real name, admits to being a prostitute. She's been walking the streets of Knoxville and working up hustles in local bars for 10 years now. At 30, she says she's had enough.
I'm looking for a way out. I just need the money to do it.
She talks about how she wants to get off the street and she wants to do something better with her life, but, somewhere back down the road she's had the opportunity to and she didn't take it.
Tina is just one of many men and women who make a living selling their bodies. Officer Gary Holliday knows Tina well. He's busted her on several occasions. It's part of his job to help clean up the streets of Knoxville.
See the guy going in with the black hat on and the trench coat? Yeah. That's Reggie. Reggie he's a big, he used to be until a couple days ago, a big downtown guy streetwalker.
Unless they can actually catch prostitutes in the act of being picked up, police say the only thing they can do is keep a watchful eye out for anyone who looks suspicious.
Holiday says, like this guy.
So what are you doing up here? Hanging out. Why do you hang out up here? More than likely, as many times as I've seen him down here, he's probably soliciting. That's just really an educated guess. But, you know, he's been down here every night for the past 2 weeks.
The life of a hooker is riskier than ever.
There's some prostitutes working the streets of Knoxville that have AIDS.
I just use my protection because a lot of the guys that come down here, you know, date them too.
And for many prostitutes, those dates can end up deadly. Holiday says Tina has been stabbed by her Johns before. Her friend, another prostitute, Patty Rose Anderson, came out of Cahaba Lane in a body bag.
She was a good girl. She just made some wrong decisions in life. You know?
3 other women who were known to hang out where prostitution is a way of life also wound up dead on Cahaba Lane.
Think about it. Of course I'm scared. Wouldn't you be? I don't have any choice.
Robin Sells, Action 10 News, Night Beat.
I want to bring my colleague in, WBIR investigative reporter.
Howdy, howdy.
Howdy,
Chuck,
John North.
Yes.
Yeah. John covered this story extensively too, and really is going to dive into the trial, which was a whopper. But bringing it back, there was a true sense of fear, as we heard from those women and their families. We did a lot of stories with the families. Charles, you did one too. Talk about that experience and how you're having to report on a heinous crime, but then be very mindful of the hurt and the tragedy these families had experienced.
That's one of the toughest things you have to do as a journalist sometimes, is you don't mean to be callous and insensitive, but sometimes you do have to stick a microphone in someone's face and, you know, we'd like to hear what you have to say about something. And I can't remember the circumstances of how we landed this interview, but I did interview one of the sisters of one of the young women. And, you know, to this day, I just think the great tragedy of it all, well, tragedy that these young women died, but tragedy that these families did not truly get justice. That we're going to get into that later, that Huskey was not convicted of the murders. But I remember talking to her, and just, she was angry, she was just heartbroken, and just felt like, I wish I could have done something to help my sister, and this would not have happened. And and you know, later I would leave Channel 10 and go to work in law enforcement media relations for about 4 years for the Knox County Sheriff's Department. So I, you know, you as a journalist, a lot of times you meet the family members of victims of crimes. But then I also saw it from the law enforcement side. We would have family members, and of course you'd have to interview them. The detectives would interview them, and you see firsthand kind of the impact of a violent death on a family. You can imagine. You look at the Shannon Christian's father to this day. I mean, that poor man. My heart breaks for him every time I see him, every interview I see with him. And you can see, you know, I mean, I personally had a nephew who passed away at a young age, and that's tragic. But when it's a young person who dies a violent death, that they had their whole life in front of them and someone took that away, there's just something infuriating about that. And so you just really, really feel for the families.
Yeah, as a reporter, it doesn't mean we're not human and don't feel as we're tasked with telling these stories, and you hit on it. These were violent deaths. And Thomas Zooman Huskey was suspect number one. Let's talk about that.
Pretty much from the start, to be honest with you, because if you remember, he actually had been caught in the act out at Cahaba Lane in, I think, about February of '92. Tom Presley, who was with KPD, was working on the city side of these cases, talking to the women when he could earn their trust, right? I mean, these are usually two groups of people that do not trust each other. One's always arresting the other. But KPD knew we've got to build up some trust with these women if we're going to get anywhere, because a man was picking them up and raping them. And at first, that's what he did, and he would steal from them. But Presley had one of these women, victims, who she had decided to cooperate with him, and she's like, well, I'll take you out to where he took me. And so that's what she did. They rode out together to Cahaba Lane, and they get there, and there's Tom Huskey and a woman, and they are in the middle of sex. And Presley arrested him at that point. So in February, I think that's correct, in '92, he's on their radar. That was his MO. But the women amongst themselves knew him. They knew he had kind of a menacing appearance. He had a beard. He's not a bad-looking guy. He had good full hair. He was probably late 20s at that point. But they knew him initially as the guy who had an association with the Knoxville Zoo. I think you mentioned that. And because his father worked at the zoo, Frank was an elephant keeper trainer.
Thus, Zoo Man.
Zoo Man, that's where that comes from. And at least initially, with some of the attacks that he was making against these women, who he knew would probably not say anything, by the way, because he could take advantage of. They worked the streets. He knew that. He was very cynical about what he did. He knew they wouldn't say much. But initially, at least some of the women early on, he took them close to the zoo. He knew the grounds, and that was a place where he could take them. That's where that nickname came from.
So, from that point on, they identify him. This is our guy. It's not a quick and easy thereafter by any means. This case would span years.
Yeah, I came here. I came here to be the state courts reporter, and I would always run into you at the courthouse in summer '93. And one of the things when I was interviewing for the job was my boss, a guy I love dearly, said, one of the cases that you're going to have to cover, get ready, is our serial killer, and he's called the Zoo Man. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, this sounds very interesting. I had covered a lot of crime in Kansas City, but not a serial, well, I had covered a serial killer. I hadn't covered somebody nicknamed Zoo Man before, so I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. You were talking about how long it went on. So, to be brief, summer '93, I start covering it. You had already been covering it.
Did you cover any of the trials?
Not much.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
you're really on the high, on the front end of it.
When the crimes first happened, that was more me. Yeah.
But the death penalty trial was in early '99, and that even wasn't the end of it. It just kept on going.
Yeah, we're going to progress to that for sure. But do you all remember? Do you remember Charles when he was arrested? Because I was trying to go back in my mind and remember. I remember when the bodies were discovered, but I cannot, for the life of me, remember exactly how the arrest came to pass.
And I do not.
It was '92.
Yeah, it was not too long. As John mentioned, they zeroed in on Huskey fairly quickly, and then and
did you get a sense of relief once they arrested him? That okay,
life in Knoxville kind of returned to normal a little bit downtown, and we had downtown merchants. They were seeing impacts. People were not on the streets. People were scared, especially in the old city area.
In Magnolia Avenue.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go ahead and start progressing toward the legal aspect of this. You got lawyered up with some defense attorneys. Talk about that.
Yeah, well, Tom was smart man, cunning man, knew how to work the streets, and he had a bit of a fanciful imagination. And so this is my take on it based on having covered the case for a very long time. Tom is in jail. He's watching television because there's not much you can do when you're an inmate waiting to be prosecuted. And he starts trying to cook up a way, how am I going to get out of this, or what's my answer going to be? The cops got me in flagrante, if you will, back in February. They the night or close to the night they arrested him, they'd gone down to his parents' mobile home in Sevier County and found some of the things of the victim, one of the victims, some jewelry. So they had that. They had some twine or cord that was the same kind that had bound some of the victims that you saw brought out. So the case looked pretty good, and he's got to figure out a way to do this. The police and the prosecution believe he then cooked up this idea of multiple personalities. And we are both old enough to remember the 70s when that was the hot thing.
Yes.
You had Sybil, you had Three Faces of Eve, it was very sexy. Oh, it's not me that did it, it's my evil side. And that's what he came up with, or at least that's what emerged. He had an evil personality, Kyle.
Kyle, yeah.
Who did everything horrible, did all the crimes. Tommy was there in body, but not in mind.
And Kyle did not like Tommy.
Tommy didn't like Kyle. Vice versa. There was a Timothy who was kind of an effeminate personality, and then Tom, for amusement, threw in a
British
accent. A guy named Reginald Dax. I think the prosecution had decided he plucked that off of one of the daytime soaps. So that's kind of clever, right? I mean, all right. And that's what he sort of came up with. And he introduced the sheriff's office to Kyle soon after he was taken into custody, and he's down in the jail, and like the TBI and the sheriff's office is trying to talk to him, and he's not being responsive. But then he apparently decided this is the time to let Kyle come out, and he told, I think it was Dave Davenport, who was with the TBI, he said something to the effect of, when Dave was trying to talk to him, this sort of person emerged and this demeanor changed, and this voice said, "Give me a cigarette and I'll tell you everything I know. My name's Kyle and I hate Tommy." That's pretty theatrical, pretty juicy.
That would stop someone in their tracks. So at this point, when this is playing out, are you at BIR still, or are you at the sheriff's department?
What year was that?
That would have been 92 still.
92,
Yeah, I was
so you're
late
still at the
92.
station.
I was here till 95.
Okay.
I was annoying you, Robin, up until 1995.
Well, it was never an annoyance. It was always a joy.
I remember
But
when she was a kid reporter, guys. She came
eons ago,
Yeah.
and as you heard in that package that I just did, that Southern
Yeah.
accent, that North Carolina accent came through. But
Yeah,
this is as you're recounting it, because my coverage of it was very limited. You all were much more in the trenches. But are you, as a reporter, going, wow?
Yeah,
this isn't your average everyday story.
Well, you're first hearing, like John said, the collection of the evidence, the twine and stuff. Okay, well, he's done.
You think.
So I think, okay, there's going to be a plea bargain at some point, and we're going to be done with this. And then, like John says, he invents this. Well, okay, Huskey and former attorneys, don't sue me, because I'm not going to sit here and say, I believe Huskey did it. All I can say for certain is that law enforcement believes strongly that Huskey did it, and they believe that to this day. And the other thing you can't dispute is that once Huskey was arrested, the killing stopped.
Yeah, they definitely stopped.
And like you said, the temper.
Yeah, so did the rapes
Temperature.
on the street. I mean, women, the prostitutes
Crime
were
rate
no
went down.
longer, I mean, it stopped. It's because they had their guy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then the trials once again do happen, but not the murder trials to begin with.
No.
They begin with the rape trials.
Yeah, the DA was Randy Nichols, who, as you'll recall, had been a judge, and then the opportunity arose for him to become the DA when Ed Dossett died in office. And so Randy was like, well, I want to be the DA. He got that job. And he and his team made a calculated decision. We're not going to go straight for death and the murders. Let's build a record on him. So let's get some convictions on him, which means that the more that we get on him when it's time to come to the murder case, he'll have this other prior stuff which we can stick him with.
Right.
So like you said, we had, I think, a couple rape trials of women who had survived some of the early attacks that I mentioned earlier on, and they got convictions in those cases for rapes and kidnappings, and it was a big deal. That would have been about 94-5, I think, in Judge Baumgartner's court. That was a big deal because those women were subjected to Pretty rough cross-examination. I mean, they were belittled, they were mocked, they were essentially told, "You're street trash, how can we believe anything you have to say?" Not an uncommon notion, back then anyway, in terms of, well, this is a hooker, you know, she's got no credibility. But the juries were convinced, and he did get time out of that. He did get time. And then there was years of litigation going for the big stakes, which was death and that murder case.
And it was compelling, the trials, theatrics. There were great theatrics.
It was one of those news stories that it was all the town talked about.
Yes.
These were the days before the internet and social media, but still it was, you know, people were watching the news. They were reading the paper every day. They wanted to know what was next. And what John brought up, I think Randy Nichols and the prosecutors tried to establish a pattern of behavior, and I think they did.
I think they did too.
They did, and you know, and not to be flippant by any means, but this is just a harsh reality. A rape victim can identify her attacker. A murder victim cannot. And there you go.
Yeah, there you go. And here we go, picking up, so the rape trials, he's convicted, serving time to this day on those charges.
Stuff, not the murder stuff.
But there was a murder trial, and that didn't come until 1999.
That's right, early 99.
Okay, let's pick up after all the legal wrangling. Here's 99. The murder trials are set to happen. Take us through that.
Well, first of all, we went over to Nashville to get a jury because by that point we'd exhausted all the jurors. We certainly couldn't get a Knox County jury, Chuck, as you said. I mean, everybody knew about the case. It had been covered ad nauseum. We'd gotten a jury, I think, out of Chattanooga before, so we'd run out of places to go. So we went to Davidson County, and that's what the defense wanted. And let's give props to Tom's two lawyers. Because he was facing the threat of the death penalty, by law he was entitled to counsel. And he got two of the very best lawyers in town, Herbert S. Monsieur and Greg Isaacs, who was at that point young in a sense and up and coming. He'd had a couple big cases, but these were two very good defense attorneys now representing Tom, and they were delighted to be able to go to Davidson County, which, as we know, is more of a traditional Democrat kind of, I hate to use the word liberal, but a little bit more maybe sensitive, not so hardcore conservative counties. And that's where we went to pick a jury. So they were already, I think it's fair to say, sort of thinking, we're helping ourselves with this. It was crazy picking a jury. It took a while. They went one by one, sort of like in the interview process. They had a dominatrix, was one of the people that they brought in, and she's telling them what they're doing. And I remember Greg questioning her, and then he's like, well, what is it you do? And she said, I'm a dominatrix. And he really couldn't say much about that after that. It's kind of,
next question.
Okay, she did not end up on the jury, but we got a jury of Davidson Countyans. They came over to Knox County. They were sequestered. They were put up in an area hotel. And the circus that we knew had always been going on for years and years now went into sort of yet another phase with the jury itself.
Okay, let's pause it right there because I want to talk about, as journalists, how we, in crimes and trials, we do our best beyond getting the obvious, trying to make connections with those attorneys, with those investigators. That is critical in the storytelling process to try to advance this story. In either of your situations, were you able to make inroads with investigators, with the attorneys to tell this story? Or was this like, nope, you'll learn it in the courtroom?
Well, why don't you answer first?
Well, old joke
First of all, you were a very credible, solid, respectable journalist.
Thank you very much.
And so
you too, John
you
North.
should. I'm sure people would tell you things they would not tell other people.
Yeah, you
and
would.
You develop those relationships oftentimes.
Yeah, you know, first of all, with Isaacs and Monsieur, they were doing their job.
Yep.
That's what they were supposed to do.
Yep.
And I remember thinking recently, Kohlberger, the guy in Idaho, I remember thinking all along, this guy has got a really good defense team, that they are able to delay this, and finally they just couldn't anymore. And they did their job. And I remember thinking, that guy's attorneys reminded me of Greg Isaacs and Herb Monsier, the way they handled the Huskey case. And I think what maybe saved Huskey was he committed the timing of these murders. He allegedly committed these murders in the early 90s, because it was DNA a few years later. I remember very specifically, John, I think this might have been a case you covered as well. Pauline George was a lady who was murdered at her West Knoxville home, and for the first time ever, the Knox County Sheriff's Department used DNA evidence to try to solve that crime. I don't believe it was ever solved. But that was a couple of years after this. You wonder if DNA might have played. Would Huskey be serving?
No doubt.
No doubt, you say?
No doubt.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the science portion of this, because there was science that was used in the murder trials.
Yeah, everybody got really excited about it. It seems kind of quaint now. We chuckle about it, but in the 1990s, we all know about the Body Farm, and that is where they do experiments on the decay and what we can learn about the decay of human bodies and how nature interacts, which was a perfect case for this, for women whose bodies had been disposed of in nature out at Cahaba Lane. Dr. Bass obviously had done a lot of research about blowflies and the development of blowflies and maggots once a human body is left outside. Because I'm sorry, but the truth is, nature's going to start taking over if you're out there dead. And that's what happened. So he was one of the witnesses called, but it was not how we would see as the rock-solid science of today. It was still kind of, how solid is this in a courtroom? Is it a little quackery? What is it? And that's no disparagement to the science. It was just kind of a different time. But he got on the stand and testified about length of time, how long the maggots or the insects that were found with the various bodies, how long they'd been alive, what their stage of development was, and what that meant in terms of how long they'd been out there. I'd never heard anything like that. That was absolutely fascinating to me. I mean, it was a little like, okay, this is a little funky, but it was very interesting. Now it's common. It's just kind of taken for granted. Or even developments have leapt ahead of that to other sort of developments and things we know about chemistry and biology. DNA, my goodness, this would have been a whole different trial with DNA and that thing right there. That thing. That's today's criminal prosecutions right there.
You can get a lot of information from this right here. So yes, this trial progressed, and the challenge with all the twists and turns and everything is for the TV viewer, for the reader of a newspaper. You have to condense all that's playing out into a minute 30. Or how many words they allow you. That is a challenge when you're talking about a story of this scope, isn't it?
I would have felt really bad for folks in TV trying to cover this case, because what are you looking at? A minute and a half, two, maybe three, if they're generous. That's not a whole lot to tell something of this scale. I was a little bit luckier at the News Sentinel. If it was a really juicy day, they would say, you can go 20 inches, 25 inches. You're like, what does that mean? That's a longer story. It's a more decent size, but it was hard. And the other thing is, you did it, and then you banged out your story, probably the same for TV, and then you went home at 8 or 9 o'clock, and then you did it all again the same day, next day.
And
and you got all this background. You got to put in every story, because you can't assume that the viewer, the reader, is familiar with it as you are. I say, and I taught a little bit at UT, and young reporters, I said, look, here's rule number one. The viewer, the reader, is not conveniently inside your head with you. Okay, so you got all that that background.
Yeah, and just
and like John says, and then you got Dr. Bass up there.
How do you explain the science of this in 90 seconds?
I'll never forget specifically Bill Williams tossing to me the story about we are trying to explain what is DNA. And I remember saying to Bill, well, Bill, it's like a genetic fingerprint. And Bill's like, well, what does that mean? He's thinking that, but he didn't say that to me. But anyway.
But we probably were all thinking, what is that? But that is the challenge that we're tasked with telling a story that the viewer, the reader can understand in a given amount of time or words. Okay, we're going to bring it back. So the trial is underway. We've got the science going on, we've got the testimony, we've got it all, and then there's the verdict. With that, take a look at this story.
This one reads that we have deliberated at length and cannot reach a unanimous decision.
Jurors sent word to the judge just after 11 o'clock this morning that they were a hung jury.
I am going to ask this question because I feel compelled to do it. Do you think, if given further opportunity to discuss the merits of this case, that you could resolve your differences, ladies and gentlemen?
Jurors declined to deliberate any further. While they agreed Huskey was guilty, they were split in half about his sanity. 6 jurors wanted to find him not guilty by reason of insanity. The other 6 believed he was sane beyond a reasonable doubt. While defense co-counsel Greg Isaacs expressed his support for his client, Huskey's parents and his 2 sons were allowed a brief visit behind closed doors.
He was extremely pleased to hug his children and to hug his mother and father. They all embraced each other and said that they loved one another.
He's happy, you know. It's not the best thing we could get, but you have to take what you can get, and I'd rather have this than have my father put to death.
A gag order remains in place for both sides in the case, but District Attorney General Randy Nichols expressed his disappointment.
We'll push on and attempt to establish our theory, regardless of what the thoughts of this particular jury was.
Carolyn Lerner says she expected more from the jury. Her sister, Susan East Stone, was one of Huskey's alleged victims.
I thought they took too many lunch breaks, too many walks, quit too early, 4 o'clock. They didn't work till 5:30. They should have been there till 7, 8 at night, whatever it took.
While defense attorneys plan to file a motion this week asking for acquittal, prosecutors say they'll be asking for a new trial. From Knox County Criminal Court, Krista Goldhair, Action 10 News.
A mistrial. What were your reactions when you heard that? At this point, you have left WBIR, you have left the Knox County Sheriff's Department, you're at UT, you are at the News Sentinel. You hear that verdict.
I was sick. I was sick because I'd been covering this thing for 6 years. I'd been sitting in the front row every day for all of the hearings for this trial. Court TV covered it and covered it religiously. They would have me on, I would talk about it. I had invested so much of my life in this case. I knew all the players, but probably wasn't terribly surprised because I went back and I was reading some of my old clips. They were out 4.5 days. That's a very bad sign.
Yes.
Whenever a jury is out a really, really long time, you begin to get concerned. A day and a half, sure, 2 days, yeah, you get it. But 4.5, it's like, uh-oh, this is not good. And you could tell that they were uncomfortable. They were getting uncomfortable with each other. They were unhappy at times with each other. There was a little bit of rebellion on the jury. You could tell that. You could see by the body language and the looks. You know, one juror would be kind of like looking off like this, and you're like, uh-oh, it's not so good. It was sickening because the other thing is, and of course, I can't personally let this leak into my coverage, but I'm like, the guy was there in February. That's where he went. He took the women there.
And that's you, John North, the human being, and then there's John North, the journalist.
Right.
And there is that reality.
Yeah, well, I mean, you cannot sort of write a story that says the jury incorrectly today.
Never, ever, ever, never.
Hung. They did hang. I think it's worth, because people forget this, there was not a conviction, but it's important that we remember this was kind of like a 2-phase that the jury had to go through. The first was, did he do it? The jurors decided, yes, he killed 3 of them. They could not agree on the 4th. But that was the first part of what they had to do. The second part was this whole issue of what was his mental state. Was he, for lack of a better word, insane at the time? So the jurors got through, yeah, he did 3 of them. Couldn't agree on the last victim. Couldn't agree, the one that was most recently found. But absolutely deadlocked on the whole idea if is Kyle BS or is Kyle a manifestation of multiple personalities, and that was it. They were done, and they didn't like each other. They didn't get along. They were frustrated. The forewoman, Leslie Boone, Leslie, if you're out there, hello. She's a lovely person. She was trying to hold it all together. Some of the other jurors were rebelling. I ended up talking to them a couple weeks after. It was a mess.
A mess.
A mess.
And it's a mess that at this point you didn't have to cover, but you watched. Was there a part of you that pined to be back in the world of journalism? You started this story, and then to be at the end of that story.
I guess my reaction was, wow, really? That's you're just expecting a conviction, because like you say, the evidence is there. But yeah, and my reaction always is thinking back to that woman I interviewed, that sister, and all those families that they can't say. Like I say, I've seen people who had a loved one who died a violent death. And of course, nothing brings them back, but you do think they deserve some measure of justice. And that maybe was not truly the case. I know they convicted Huskey of aggravated rape, but they didn't convict him of murder. And you just really, really feel badly for the families.
It was a big letdown.
It was.
It was a big letdown. That's right. That's a good way to put it, John.
Even the jury was let down. I mean, they were all kind of disgusted because they come over here to Knox County from Davidson County, and there's an expectation that they're going to do their job one way or another. And a hung jury is not the way you finish it off. A little side story: when I was talking to them, the forewoman, Leslie Boone, told me this story. They loaded up in a bus to go back to Nashville, and they kind of sort of parted their ways, and they had a bottle of booze. I think it was like bourbon or whiskey, and some of them sat in the back and drank on the way back, and some of them didn't want to. If they didn't want to have anything to do with the people in the back, they sat up front. And Leslie said, and she was sitting in the back, and they were all just kind of passing this around and having a drink. She said it was medicinal.
Needed.
Well, they had a difficult job.
Yeah,
it was a difficult job.
And I would not want to have been of all the things.
Not that one.
Not that one, but boy.
And it's interesting from a reporter's perspective, no matter what court case it is, to watch the jury as they are taking in the information. You can oftentimes glean a lot from their reaction.
Yeah, there's a reason body language experts are sitting in the audience telling the lawyers what they're seeing, Yeah.
I tell young reporters, I still love covering court. It's fun, and I still get to do it every once in a while. And I always tell reporters, young ones, because we get a lot of them coming through here, I'm like, you may think that this is boring, but it's incredibly fascinating, and there's a whole lot going on right in front of you, so always pay attention. And while you can't be intrusive in terms of looking at the jury, I promise you, they are going to look at you, and there's a lot of unspoken communication there, and that's okay. And that's what was going on in that trial.
Be observant.
I'll tell you this quick story. I have a friend who was an attorney, and one day we were at the YMCA at the end of the day, and he's working out, and he was kind of dejected, and I said, "You okay, man?" And he said, "Well, I had a case today, and I thought, there's no way I can lose. And I lost." And he's just shaking his head like, when it's in the hands of 12 jurors, you don't know what might happen.
You can't get in their brains.
You do not know.
We're going to wrap up, but before we do, I ask this question of my guests every time, but how does this story exemplify the responsibility and the power of local journalism? Chuck?
Good one. Journalists, you touched on this, we're also human, and we're part of this community as well. And, we have a responsibility to report the news accurately with no bias and let people decide, but we also we're proud of our community too, and we want the best for it. And to see people suffering, that's really tough.
Yes.
Well, a couple things. It's what we do, right? I mean, we get into this profession with eyes wide open, we're here, whether people believe us or not, to inform the public and to hopefully hold people accountable. So that's kind of the mindset you go into with a case like this. This case was so kind of bizarre. There was a moment in the lead up to the trial where a source gave us information about the defense and their expenses and what they were spending their money on. We wrote some stories about it. We were ordered by Judge Baumgartner not to publish. That's called prior restraint in the United States. And that's just part of one of the side stories of this wacky case that we had to talk at the News Sentinel about. Do we publish or not publish? And I was like, we publish or I quit.
You take a stand.
Yeah,
yes.
we published, and then and then the judge is like, oh my God, they published. I told them not to, and they still publish. And we're like, yeah. And then our lawyers are like, okay, let's resolve this, which we did. But it was just this case.
It's just you guys doing your job.
Well,
yes.
You would hope. You would hope. But the other thing is, and I appreciate your point very much, that there are still to this day people who are living out their lives in the wreckage of what this person did.
This, for them, this story will never go away.
No.
You're through reporting it. You're through reporting it. We are. But
Hope
they're
so,
living
anyway.
it. Yeah, that's true. But yeah, that is the reality. That is the reality. And for the Thomas Zuman Huskey, his reality is he's still in prison.
Still in prison, at least for a bit longer.
Yeah. All right. John, Charles, thank you so much
Thank you,
for
Robin.
your memories, your insight, your wisdom, and thank you for watching. And we hope you'll join us for our next episode of Behind the Headline.